right, welcome everybody to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I think many of us here have observed that a new pantheon of gods has been cooked up in a sort of witch's brew, a cauldron, and are being unveiled digitally in the form of this new AI religion, artificial intelligence worship, as one of the aspects of this strange dystopic kind of new religious order that some would like us to think is the inevitable eventual replacement of the outdated software called human civilization 1.0. And I think in a time of insanity, it's good to laugh a little bit and to use satire to question the foundations of some of these artificial gods. And I was very impressed when Rui Grazina reached out to me and sparked a little conversation and even shared a book that he recently published in October on this very topic of the digital dehumanization of modernism, which I was so impressed by his quality of analysis, of his intersectional thinking. Rui, after all, is an architect, but also a philosopher, somebody who swims pretty well in the field of epistemology, and so I asked him, "Hey, would you like to give a class?" I was delighted to hear that he was happy to give a class. And so today we are going to experience the outcome of that. And Rui has taken the challenge of condensing a lot of the essential ideas in his book, which I haven't finished reading, but everything I've read so far I really like, into a presentation, about, like usual, about an hour or so. And then we're going to open up for, 45, 60 minutes of open dialogue with the audience. And the full class today is the digital dehumanization of modernism, artificial intelligence, and the modern paradigm. So, Rui, thank you so much. You have screen sharing powers, and the stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation, and hello to everybody. And okay, I hope this condensing of the book works in some way. I'll try to, and maybe I can start sharing the screen, or is it already?
No,
No.
it's up to you to
Okay.
hit share.
Okay. Oh, can you see it
It's
then?
excellent.
Yeah. Okay. So as Matthias so kindly said, the name of the presentation is the name of my book, The Digital Dehumanization of Modernism, Artificial Intelligence and the Modern Paradigm. And this is a book that I published on last October. And in the presentation, I will try to basically I'll try to follow the structure of the book. Sorry, I have a little problem here because I changed the way that the screen looks, and I'll try to get back to the other. I'm sorry, I'm not a very good. Oh, there you go. Sorry. So the structure of the presentation is the structure of the book. Basically, these 6 chapters: introduction, modernism as an inversion against tradition, the loss of complexity and the rise of technocracy, analogical and digital worlds, tradition and meaning, and finally this sort of stage that I think we are living through in some way, and which I try to designate as an epistemological war. Okay, sorry. Uh, I'm trying to get my presentation working. I'm sorry. Can you listen to me? Well,
Yeah, everyone can hear you just fine. If you're having trouble scrolling, have you just tried the up or down keys? That often works for.
yes, I'm trying, but
Yeah.
I think I changed something here. Oh,
Oh,
is this working now?
that works.
Okay. Okay. So I think that this overwhelming dissemination of what we nowadays designate as artificial intelligence is in some ways not the beginning of a new process, but rather the culmination of one that started quite a long time ago. And I think that architecture and the arts have become mainly vehicles for exercises of absurdity as they despise tradition and meaning, and these values have been replaced by a sort of narcissistic nihilism. I argue in my book that modernism established a number of objectives from a political and ideological standpoint that enabled, at certain key levels, an anti human momentum and a deliberate questioning of beauty. While modernism could still be experienced through specific mediums such as architecture, painting, or music, obviously, and thus could be an object of critique within such cultural contexts, AI operates in a fundamentally distinct way. Its influence is more diffuse, and yet it reshapes our thought and reshapes our own perception. AI does not encourage education, diverse perspectives, or genuine inquiry, as it rather reinforces the ideology of its designers. In that sense, I think that it works as a digital feudal system, placing the general population in the position of passive recipients, while the architects of the system may act as some sort of modern day feudal lords. Modernism promoted an abstract idea of humanity, one that was shaped by a mechanical paradigm, and one that would guide a progressive evolution based on individual in a world without tradition and transcendence. So my argument, or my main argument, is that AI is merely the last installment in such legacy, as it currently embeds these values deeper and deeper into the very fabric of our society. René Descartes placed pure reason at the root of knowledge and being, and the Enlightenment also questioned inherent beliefs and thus played a major role in building a skepticism toward tradition, namely the one represented by the church and by monarchy. Rather than beings with a soul and with personhood, human beings could be construed as mechanical systems belonging in an essentially mechanical universe. I think that such change was and is crucial for the understanding of the hegemonic paradigm that has shaped our cultural worldview in contemporaneity. Modernism will thus appear as much more than an artistic movement associated with a society in a profound process of change, such has been the narrative that is mainly been fed to us and mainly associated with modernism. I think it will rather be the visible face of an attack on tradition and transcendence by means of introducing a seismic shift on visual language and visual symbology. And to start our analogies, visual analogies that we'll do a lot within this book, we may start by looking at a study by Borromini in the 16th to the 17th century, study of the tomb of Urban VIII, and compare that with an illustration from Mies van der Rohe in the 20th century in 1921 for a proposed building. I think that an extreme event took place at the beginning of the 20th century. Art changed, changed drastically, and so did architecture. The first change was that stability gave way to instability. This instability went much deeper than a reflection of a society in change, as it was the narrative, and it is, I think. A change where stable models became unstable in order to mirror the very same instability within a society in change. But I think that these were rather useful notions ingrained in order to create forms of societal mind control. The last slide's image by Boccomini, the study, is one of where we find stability enabled by symmetry. It refers to the human figure and has a perspective convergence within its lines. On the other side, on the other hand, this illustration by Mies van der Rohe shows a notion of architecture that becomes autistic to its urban setting. It is also, in my opinion, an example of an aggression, as it represents a self-centered idea of construction. Instead of being centered on man, it is immersed in its own abstraction. And maybe this should make us wonder about the nature of such profound change. I think that this mechanical paradigm produced, above all, a solipsistic search for individuality. In this other analogy and confrontation of drawings of the Tuscan order with plans for the Ville Savoie by Corbusier, a project that we'll look at several times in this presentation, I propose that it's possible to observe an enormous conceptual change. In the Tuscan order, what we observe are forms of dealing with order itself and the connection of the building to the tectonic forces that rule them, that rule it. The level of detail was reminiscent of nature and of the human body, and in that sense, there was an organic sense of purpose. In the case of Corbusier, all that level of complexity has been replaced by a new form of mechanistic, functional, and ultimately what we might call technocratic view of the relation between man and construction. Like in a painting of or a study by Michelangelo of the human figure, different parts of that figure connect to the whole and fall into place. They become a sort of a metaphorical interpretation of our own body and the forces that it has to deal with. When we reach modernity, one of the key factors, as we can illustrate here with a famous Marcel Duchamp painting, we lose that contrapuntal complexity as modernity arrives. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man illustrates the proportions described by Roman architect Vitruvius, who believed that the human body could be the model for architectural harmony. It brought the notion of man as the measure of all things, and the Renaissance notion of the mech anthropos, that idea that a human being is a microcosm, and that microcosm reflects the larger macrocosm of the universe. There is an offset between the square and the circle that compose it, and that reflects the idea that although man reflects the cosmos, such reflection isn't yet perfect, and that correction might be man's responsibility. We could call it, in musical terms, a Pythagorean coma of sorts. So, in that sense, the universe would need man to complete its perfectness. On the other hand, the modular, a contraction of module and nombre d'or, was established by Le Corbusier as the idea of a standard man. I think it was, and I'm not the only one to think that, above all, a system of self-promotion, but it was also a form of establishment of standardization and massification over what is elaborate and what is particular. And this meant the debasement of tradition and a vehicle for a profound, or another vehicle for a profound societal change. I think we may even see these changing mindsets and purposes unfolding in the drawing approaches of some of the key protagonists of modernism. In the case of Corbusier, that change becomes almost palpable. Firstly, in his illustration of the Acropolis in Athens from 1911, we find a relatively conventional approach to representation. Then, some 20 years later, we are in a very diverse pictorial universe, one that we might easily connect to Pablo Picasso or any other Cubist painter. I would question, and I would leave that question, was this an accident? Something that was in the zeitgeist? Or was this rather something that was being engineered? The new modernist dwellings, the material changes, the transformations of the built environment, could these rather be concerted vehicles for a radical psychological change, producing an overall program of profound social change? And further to that query, which social change and program was this, if not one of alienation? Modern architecture was structurally based on a blind belief in mechanical progress. Some of these beliefs are still present currently in architectural practice, in academia, in all schools, despite the fact they have been proven time and time again to fail, and normally to fail disastrously. And maybe something that is not very talked about, maybe we should not forget that Le Corbusier himself was a collaborator of the Vichy regime. When we look at something like his plan Voisin for Paris, massive uh, development that you see on that image for the south bank of the River Seine that destroyed all the existing fabric and created these new, let's put it, model dwellings that was never built, luckily. According to James Stevens Curl, the modern movement attempted a deliberate disruption of existing geometries. This was not a contrast of aesthetics, but a fundamental clash with physiology, in the sense that we as human beings evolved to accommodate forms responding to gravity, not predominantly to the horizontal or to the horizontal lines or to the horizontal shapes. Construction is one of the most important primeval forms of expression of the human existence. It established a human presence in the territory that has always marked the landscape, defining a material and symbolic occupation. Classical architecture created meaning unto itself by means of its particular languages originated in Greek and Roman ancient tradition. With modernism, a major shift occurred, and there was an introduction of something diametrically diverse. There was a coldness within its, what we might call, not language, but anti-language, and that makes us think that man had been left out and not worthy of such new high ideals. As a comparison of sorts, again, we can look at San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, a church in Rome from 1646, once again by the architect and painter Francesco Borromini, and put it in a confrontation with 1929's Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. And I think that the two plans convey astounding differences in worldviews. In Borromini, we find a building that is like an embrace, enveloping the people inside, in a sort, becoming a sort of a biological entity that unfolds around itself. Mies van der Rohe building, on the other hand, is the opposite of an organic form. It's a labyrinthine structure defined by straight walls. And these spaces do not unfold around the human presence. I think they rather command it, that they command that human presence into the workings of a mechanistic framework. So from Borromini's biological entity turned into construction, we go to a framework of rationalism. Such space, the one by Mies van der Rohe, is not conceived as an embrace, but as a cell, an inversion of a feeling of human compassion, not touching the human elements. It does not convey a sense of highly developed refinement either, except maybe into itself, into its own solipsistic logic. I would argue that one is devised to house man on a divine function and to serve as a place of and a space of contemplation, whereas the other is conceived as a technocratic maze. And I think that man is the entity that becomes lost within that maze. Throughout the ages, building has been an intricate play between the vertical and the horizontal. Verticality in itself is an expression of gravity, and horizontality represents our own perception of the stability of the space we move upon. Even with its intrinsic relative simplicity, we may find in Paleolithic, Trilithic structures a sense of presence and belonging. Such architecture grounds us, envelops us in a sense of protection, and it creates a sense of belonging, I would argue. In classical architecture, an order defined a certain intrinsic logic by means of a number of proportions and established rules. With modernism, one of the major changes was that architecture became oriented to functionality and offered none of those primeval connections between man and nature. But yet, modernism introduced horizontality as its main focus in architecture. The basic post and lintel structure evolved in Greece to other levels of complexity as its orders went from Doric to Ionic and further to Corinthian. The architectural composition of a classical building had a parallel in the grammar of a written language. Its equilibrium and sense of proportions might be compared to intervals in music, with its discrete parts playing a very definite role in terms of harmony, tension, and balance. One of the substantial changes introduced by the modern movement was to take away the notion of verticality as the most undeniable expression of gravity, as the materiality that it must assume in order to oppose such very force of gravity. It has an obvious relationship also with man's upright posture and what that expresses itself of human development. Obviously, horizontality is the complement to verticality in the sense that it completes the logic of building, but I stress that the vertical sets the emphasis given the value of what it represents. One of the main tenets of modernism was the supposed fight of a progressive war against a failed morality and a failed convention. And that was absolutely contrived, I would argue. Rather, it was essential for modernism to establish a sort of tabula rasa around what were the prevailing structures of power, the structures of thinking, and by means of changing the very structures of representation. There was an essential need to create a new image, a new clear paradigm expressed through a new visual and built image, and ultimately by a new sort of identity. And once again, I would question, is it not identity that we are considering when we look at Diego Velázquez, Las Meninas from 1656, and we compare it to Willem de Kooning 3 centuries later in his portrait of a woman? In the words by Jesuit Arthur Vermeersch, written in 1911, and taking into account that he's referring to modernism within the church, but yet I think his words are worth pondering upon. So, quote, in general, we may say that modernism aims at that radical transformation of human thought in relation to God, man, the world, and life, here and hereafter, which was prepared by humanism and 18th century philosophy and solemnly promulgated at the French Revolution. For thinkers such as Herbert Reed, modern art was not so much of a revolution, but rather a breakup, and one with a catastrophic character. And we should consider that the universal acceptance of modernism in architecture and in the arts was highly contrived. Modernism in the 1930s captivated the rich and fashionable society and large commercial and financial groups, all in the United States. After the Second World War, it was seen as the antithesis of classicism that had been favored by the architecture of Nazi Germany, uh, particularly the one conveyed by his main proponent, Albert Speer. Afterwards, during the Cold War, it was seen as an opposition to Stalin and to the Soviet Union. A figure like Corbusier is essential because he didn't hide his own theoretical program, and he wanted nothing short than the destruction of tradition. In this drawing from a lecture in Buenos Aires in 1929, named "This is not architecture," I think that this message becomes quite clear. And it becomes clear also that modernism was indeed a system of total inversion of human values that concealed, above all, the construction of a society that enriched those involved in its creation, but impoverished those who had to live and work in it. Also, indoctrination was a constant basis for modernism. We could find this in the thinking of the Frankfurt School scholar Herbert Marcuse and his notion of repressive tolerance, for instance. This being, in the case of modernist thinking, an absolute tolerance for modernism itself in all its incoherent assertions, in all its failed models, and a total prejudice against tradition. Other thinkers, such as Theodor Adorno, also from the Frankfurt School, argued that only avant-garde composition, and one might say in the field of music, the composition of one of his proteges, Arnold Schoenberg, only avant-garde composition could truly answer the modern quest, and that would be by negating tradition. And we see here an extraordinary uh, drawing by Le Corbusier, an urban plan for Rio de Janeiro, where he replaced or went over all the fabric of the city that connects the sea, the mountain, the green, etc., with a number of flyovers and massive buildings. Modernism always also proposed its position as an enlightened one, the idea of a progressive future led by a technologically enlightened society leads me to think that at the basis of modernism, we already had the seeds of the hyper technological state we find ourselves in today. And I find that one of the key points in this transformation is the confusion, well, maybe not confusion, but engineered confusion, maybe between complexity with ornament. Stephen Curls writes a very interesting, has a very interesting quotation here that I will read, although I'll explain at the end why I don't agree with it completely. So, quoting, throughout the ages, humankind has embellished its creation with ornament. If one considers examples of the architecture of ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, China, Japan, India, Hellenic and Hellenistic culture, the Roman Empire, Islam, Carolingian and Romanesque Europe, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, Baroque, neoclassical periods, 19th century historicism, even the arts and crafts, and indeed of any period in human history, ornament has played no small part in them all. And although, unquote, and although I agree with this idea that Stephen Scarroll refers to, that ornament was always a part of building, uh, the primeval act of building. I would say that calling it ornament uh, is not totally correct. It should be called complexity. And I will try to explain this better as we move along. Modernism's vision of a removal of detail might be clearly observed in painting and drawing, in my opinion. In a painting like the one that we saw by Velázquez, Las Meninas, or in the last slide, in a portrait by Rubens, we have examples of multidimensional particular universes, and we could call this the sheer opposite of a Jackson Pollock, for instance. I think that we went from the possibility of dealing with the organic and the complex, and when we reached modernism, modernism brought the programmatic reduction of complexity through the repetition of a machine-driven paradigm. And this illustration by Having Jackson Pollock here as an illustration is not accidental. It's not just the fact that he's a modernist per se, but I think it's difficult to find another example of somebody that represents this repetition of a machine-driven paradigm, if we want to call it that way. Also, I think that we are here at the inception of technocracy. And some of modernism's main figures had no qualms at showing their inherent inhumanity in achieving their own program. Adolf Loos was one of the most prominent proponents of an utterly bleak and nihilistic worldview, and in that sense, of the disingenuous transformation of complexity into ornament. Quoting Loos, he writes that, quote, ornament means squandered manpower and thus squandered health. It has always been so. But today it also means squandered capital, and both together means squandered capital. As the ornament is no longer organically connected with our culture, ornament is no longer the expression of our culture, unquote. And in the 1920s, Luz was a prominent architect in Vienna with such friends as the one that we refer to Theodor Adorno's protege, the music composer Arnold Schoenberg. And I was going to propose an illustration here with um, with a musical score by Schoenberg, but then I found an even maybe more adequate one by another later modernism, Giorgio Ligeti from 1968, and I'll leave this for you to ponder as I uh, juxtapose this musical score by Ligeti to the famous Seagram building in New York by Mies van der Rohe, and maybe we can discuss the meaning of what I try to do with this analogy. I think that the deceitful distortion of the idea of complexity into the notion of ornament serves the purpose of introducing a massive change at the cultural level and ultimately of an ideological, cultural, and political program. Complexity in itself enables natural and harmonic connections, nuance, and subtlety, and as such, it enables us to reach new analogical horizons and as such of driving us to new levels of thinking. Nature, in its transcendent beauty and endless multiplicity, is in itself the best illustration of complexity, and maybe we should ponder about the fact that maybe that's precisely what is being taken away from us. In the distance, in the distance between Oskar Schlemmer and Albrecht Dürer, we travel from the Vitruvian man to a mechanical device of sorts. And I think that there is no place for humanity in a technocracy. Technocracy was and is a system that ultimately aims to install systems of governance and societal organization in which decision making is dominated by technical experts rather than by democratic processes, traditional authorities, and even metaphysical or theological consideration. This does not seem very far from the problems we are observing now in our societies, and I think that maybe that should not surprise us too much. A technocratic process is one of severe reductionism. Technocracy always had an intimate connection with cybernetics, and a big problem occurred when cybernetics tried to tackle ecosystems. Feedback loops in ecosystems don't always stabilize the system, and ecosystems can and sometimes do tend towards chaos or collapse. This is obviously because nature does not work like a machine. In that sense, we might see that the rise of technocracy connected in a number of ways to the loss of complexity. Complexity means the acknowledgement of tradition, our primordial connection to the past and to our collective memory. Further to modernism, with postmodernism, instead of complexity, what we were presented with more than ever was its quasi political process of deconstruction of the past. Truth, in that sense, was discarded, and in that same process, so was humanity. There were no objects left, only processes and relationships. The The meta-narratives and language games from figures such as Lyotard, deconstruction from Derrida, and panopticism, even from Michel Foucault, were all part of a big program of taking modernism one step further into the abyss, the void of postmodernism, and into a total disconnection from humanity. And as architecture lost its language and inherent meaning, it became a vehicle for an offensive on perception itself. And I think that at that point, language and visuality became perfect partners in an endeavor for change. Through multiple language deceptions, in a world obsessed with image itself, the distortion of reality became the natural outcome. The so-called present AI dependence we are observing is no other than the natural conclusion of a sort of a process, I would argue. It is yet another step in the atomization of meaning and on the disintegration of the values of tradition, memory, and knowledge. Having achieved that, it represents consequently an assault on our very own thinking capabilities. This technocratic solution was thus brought upon us also in a way as a form of a chaos. The so-called singularity, according to AI pioneer Ray Kurzweil, would constitute the moment when a machine emulation of intelligence would acquire autonomy through self-learning, being then able to surpass human intelligence. According to Ray Kurzweil, such singularity should be expected by 2045, although he has already proposed other dates. These claims are supported, like all claims of emulation of the human mind by AI, on the assumption that the mind might be reducible to a mechanical system. But uh, authors such as Jobst de Landgrab and Barry Smith, which are tech entrepreneurs and very respected philosophers, also argue that an artificial intelligence that could equal or exceed human intelligence, what is sometimes called AGI or artificial general intelligence, is impossible. And they argue this by mathematical reasons, not even going further into other sort of considerations, just by mathematical reasoning, that is impossible. And it's also impossible to make a very good reduction of their thinking because it's very complex. But I will put it into points and say that according to them, human intelligence is a capability of a complex dynamic system, the human brain and central nervous system, and two, systems of this sort cannot be modeled mathematically in a way that allows them to operate inside of a computer. Yet, we are being constantly bombarded with these possibilities of an AI that has human faculties and human intelligence, and further, one that is on the brink of consciousness. But in point of fact, both in human and animal life, these notions of intelligence and even in a more complex way, consciousness, are extremely complex notions that are still scientifically debated and not at all fully defined in any way. So I wonder, how can something that we don't even fully understand in ourselves or in lower forms of life can claim to be achieved by us through machines? And I think that complexity is not a mere accumulation of data, and Kurzweil's considerations are based upon a Cartesian paradigm of information. Complexity, as we have been discussing, against the normative example imposed by the modernist paradigm, is a reflexive concept, and I think that is deeply connected to identity. The identity of a column in Greek or Roman architecture, for instance, or in of a Greek mode in music, that they don't depend solely on data, and it must be defined as more than a Cartesian extensive quality. I think that identity might be, within this context, defined as being bigger than the sum of its parts, in the same way that our own personhood surpasses our pure Cartesian thought, our embodiment, or even our soul. We might also consider complexity in terms of the works it produces in the arts. In Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, we are in a totally diverse level of complexity of any painting by Jackson Pollock, by Willem de Kooning, any other modernist, or in this case, by Mark Rothko. These modernist efforts are mainly unidimensional and lack differentiation, in my argument. On the diametrical opposites, Caravaggio's painting is vibrant with life, detail, and above all, is vibrant with meaning. In a Rothko painting, or in the architecture of Gehry that we saw in the last slides, we observe procedures based on quantity rather than on quality. And I think this is very, very important to ponder upon. And this is the fact that these processes and these paintings and this architecture, they all might be deceptively complex. They might be deceptively complex, and they are complex in a way, but that is the nature of their processes. And it's not the nature and essence of the thinking involved in its creation. And I think this is really important. They might be deceptively complex, and they produce very complex works of art and architecture, but that is the nature of their own processes, individual processes, and not the nature of the thinking involved in its creation. And I do think that modernism wanted all along to be an instrument of subversion. With the removal of complexity, organicity was replaced by a mechanical character, but above all, by the concerted effect of all its disparate strategies. The resulting effect in the long term would be the removal of the identity itself. And I would question again, is that not in many ways what we observe in the world around us presently? A metaphor, a metaphor imaginatively transfers meaning from one domain to another through emotional, aesthetic, and conceptual parallels. We might find a metaphor beyond language in analogies composed by images, for instance. And my book and this presentation relies heavily on that possibility, obviously. David Bohm, the physicist, refers the American philosopher Alfred Korzybski when he considers that, quote, whatever we say is words, and what we want to talk about is generally not words, unquote. Bohm writes, mathematics is only one function of the human mind, and other functions can surely be just as important, even in physics, unquote. And let's remember that David Bohm was an incredibly important quantum physicist, and obviously the field of physics and particularly quantum physics relies heavily on mathematics, and yet he remembers that it's mathematics is only one of the functions of the human mind. So even for him, this was so relevant. We must consider also that what we mean by what we say is not what a thing actually is. And I'm paraphrasing Bohm again. A thing is always more and is never exhausted by our concepts. As such, we must understand that even if a machine could be able to actually deal with word meanings, something which it cannot absolutely do, in my opinion and many other people's opinions, expert opinions, it would still be lacking that capacity for using words as a means of surpassing their most direct meanings, of using the metaphor, let's put it this way. So a terrible realization arises yet again that the capacity for complexity, all the hallmarks of what it is to be human, is what is being taken from us by the creation of the present machine paradigm. In architecture, we might consider constructions that can be viewed as the epitome of building thought, as in themselves they represent an alliance of metaphor and meaning. We might consider the temple of the 18th dynasty Queen Hatshepsut in Egypt, in Luxor, from around the 15th century before Christ. And this, I think, is a very meaningful example. The building represents an ascent from the ground into a higher plane. As it materializes, it also represents a sense of time, the time needed to go through it and reach that higher uh, level. In its simplicity, it becomes an extremely powerful and authoritative example of the force of man towards nature. The building becomes a part of the landscape, and consequently, the construction and the metaphor it represents become one and the same. I think that we could say that the building introduces a Pythagorean comma in the structure of reality itself. The building changes the landscape, it changes the relationship between man and nature, and yet doesn't change their fundamental rules and natures. It rather introduces the human element, as if this was a missing piece. I think that through analogy, we are able to find ways of reaching human common grounds of comprehension. In that sense, analogy is not necessarily only an individual capacity, but it also plays a role in establishing common foundations and enabling a sense of tradition. Our different views as individuals might become understandable to each other, meaningful, and make us feel united. But I think there is even more than that. Through analogy, through analogy, all the wonderful operations of change of context might be enabled, and we are driven to novel capacities of creation. The beauty of a painting might inspire us to write. The elevation of a Bach fugue can drive us to an insight in mathematics, and on we could continue. This is the this is the very capacity that enables us to look at a painting by Turner and despite its ambiguous shapes and colors, to see beyond that. We are not observing an ambiguity when we look at this painting by Turner, or this watercolor rather. We are not observing an ambiguity, but rather a tumultuous sea, a strong wind enveloping a shipwreck, and a lighthouse at a distance. Our analogical capacity, connected to our own memory, enables metaphoric thinking and, as such, becomes the provider of connections between ideas or objects that are but a faint, ghostly representation before such operation is done. But given those absolutely human capabilities, we are enabled to establish extremely high-reaching interpretations based on what is in actuality very little information. And I would stress that we are just capable of doing it. imagining that an inanimate, unconscious entity might also be able to do so, even in a generally simple interpretation, I think it's rather absurd. But yet it is an idea that has been engineered into our society and that it is completely irrational. Also, and mainly, I should definitely add, it's an extremely dangerous notion. All these aspects as a whole have produced a distortion of our lived experience and ultimately of our human essence, I think. Once again, we may look at the Byzantine church of San Vitali in Ravenna from 547 AD as a counterpoint to the already referred Villa Savoie by Corbusier. On the Byzantine building, we can clearly identify a living, animated form that we might instantly relate to an organic being. The plan suggests an engaging and intriguing, complex place, full of intricacies and full of detail. On Le Corbusier's plan, we are faced with a rather erratic design, one that expresses a bleak form of rationality. The representation of beauty, humanity, and goodness enables a connection with life, the human spirit, and transcendence. Modernism represents the antithesis of such possibility and the antithesis of the possibility of analogical thinking. It is not concerned with the establishment of the metaphor. Being solipsistic, it is only engrossed with itself. And lastly, I think it is inhumane and becomes the built expression of nihilism. In Hatshepsut's temple, there was an ascensional movement by means of the ramps, as these were aimed towards the sky. In the valley temple of Khafre, dating from circa 2532 before Christ, the movement is the exact opposite, the descending tunnel into the depths of the earth as if to reach the chthonic realm. These two astonishing architectural monuments might illustrate how meaningful architecture can be and express how a metaphor can be turned into built meaning. Some buildings can be so powerful in this articulation that their messages become almost crystalline. A metaphor in its built form turns into meaning. I think that we have never lived in such an information-rich environment as we currently do. Yet we may question what is the sense of it without an epistemological framework of tradition in order to understand it. Does it really amount to something if it becomes just noise? Massive amounts of information do not necessarily mean any amount of knowledge, but we have been driven to think so. Also, we have been led to the idea that at some point, the amount of such information might reach the point where we might have a total control of the world. The more we have been led to believe in such godlike powers, so have we proportionately faced a lack of interest in tradition. There is no need for tradition and memory, considering we can do anything at any given time. And that sort of thinking might be one of the fatal flaws of our civilization. As we lose interest in tradition, our interest in knowledge has been driven and is driven currently by an individualistic sense of achievement. Since the dawn of man, the act of construction is in itself an act of establishment of complexity. If we consider the removal of the significance of detail, of the form in which a column touches a capital, for instance, as we have seen, then all we end up with, besides the distortion itself, is the paradigm of a hegemonic visual culture. I wonder if we consider such deep connection between memory, tradition, analogy, and metaphoric thinking, how might we interpret what has conducted us from the Tuscan capital of Roman architecture more than 2000 years ago to Mies van der Rohe in the 20th century? Or in another way, we could also question if what we are observing currently is nothing more than what we could expect. The material transformation of complexity, nuance, and subtlety into the assumption of barrenness and of technocracy ultimately. Once again, I argue that the current AI paradigm is a sort of final and contemporary removal of man himself from the world. Modernism obliterated the natural forces, creating a highly charged visual emphasis. This generated a deeply disembodied art and architecture and deeply incorporeal creative practices. Currently, the prevalence of AI and of all sorts of pure image production tendencies has obviously caused these approaches and outcomes to be even further developed, forceful, and prevalent. As we have been discussing in this essay, I think that without the possibility of memory enabled by tradition and the capacity for analogical thinking enabled by our very own human nature, we lose the possibility of considering the character of creative processes as larger than the sum of their parts. And that, unfortunately, then extends to our own individual and collective capacities for thought. As we see now in our world all around us, it has conducted to practices that are devoid of meaning and devoid of substance. On another example, we might look again at the Church of San Vitale by Boccomini and now at Mies van der Rohe. Further to the mechanistic character we saw in the work of Le Corbusier, we are here looking into an explosion of sorts. The square that was present in Corbusier was replaced by a sort of pure fragmentation. It's as if we have a shattering of reality itself, whereupon any sort of meaning has collapsed. Obviously, this diluted view of architecture, of life, and of the world becomes a perfect vehicle for a new vision for humanity itself. And I would argue that it's a somber, nihilistic vision of humanity beyond question. Traditional architecture was steeped in meaning and in telluric significance as it articulated its connection between man, earth, and God. Nowadays, architecture has become the expression of pure lack of meaning and of solipsistic individualism. What began as a cultural shift has now become a technological force that subtly reshapes perception, interaction, human thought, and ultimately what it might mean to be human. Today, AI has been the logical evolution of modernism, carrying forward its legacy, not to enhance human values and virtues, but to systematize their gradual erasure. This eradication is now possible to be executed at undreamt of levels, given the technological and technocratic possibilities. On the long run, I believe that if we do not address these questions and the creation of a new stance for man within this new world, we might be facing a very grim future. A brave new world, we could call it, in its most dystopian interpretation. And so I believe that the consideration of all these problems will be an essential debate and an imperative struggle if you want to work towards a sane, intelligent future for humanity. And we can almost say, to finalize, a future where we might contemplate freedom. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rui. This was Fantastic. What a excellent summary of your gestalt. Now there's so much there. I I guess just to ask you a quick question, I've noticed that amongst the the musical sector as well as the fine arts, there are movements that are growing for restoration of classical aesthetics. There's the Society for the Renewal of Art,
Hmm.
which is one very, very big institution. I mean, it's flawed. There's a lot of confusion about what classical art even means, and there's disputes and a lot of like eroticism. But still, they're trying. They're trying.
Hmm.
And I was wondering, in the domain of architecture, is there a similar movement that is well organized or becoming better organized as you see it?
Well, not not that I see it really. There are some, it's some people that tend to think that way, but I don't know. At least might be my problem, uh, my lack of knowledge. But I don't really I don't really know of it. Speaking against myself, I've always been a modernist. That's my formation was uh, somebody embedded in that. And uh, later, as I did my PhD, as I started to, and I read a lot, mainly about figures, for instance, as Corbusier, because I think is it's incredible that he's still highly considered as a person, even because he has all these dark connections in his past. He was a collaborator,
Hmm.
of the regime, the Vichy regime that collaborated with the Nazi regime. So and but that was my formation, and I've worked on the in my projects and in a lot of things that I did in this sort of minimal approach and this way of thinking about the object, which upon thinking quite a lot about it through my PhD, etc., made me question myself and what is the meaning of it. And looking at the city, for instance, and seeing how the cities have been, cities like, for instance, Lisbon, that uh, have been taken by this. It's I think it's really nihilistic architecture, that doesn't work upon building an image or contributing to the image of the city on a whole, but it's just based on individual assertions, individual um, uh, forms of expressing and showing, I'm more important than the one uh, next to me, and making this also highly visual sort of approaches. It's all based on the impact. That's something that I observe currently. I'm even thinking of starting maybe a project thinking about that. Because I think that has a direct, even if people, I see that as I walk on the streets and see the new sort of more modern buildings, they are very turned into themselves. And I think that I realize that. Maybe some of my colleagues don't. They might be actually designing those buildings. And but even if we don't notice, or just a regular person on the street, I think it has an effect on people, a deep, deep effect. So, yes. So that was a long answer, but I didn't answer. I don't, those things are, some more traditionalist people get together, and these groups, for instance, on Facebook, or something more organized, I don't know of, at least in Portugal.
Well, I know that where there has been some effort to create modern buildings, new hospitals have been built over the past several years in Canada across different locations, and they all have a very modernist sort of
Hmm.
ugly, soulless sort of veneer. But they also welcome this as soon as the thing is public. graffiti everywhere. Like that's the thing
Yes.
that I almost always see also with some of the more
Yeah.
artistic so-called highway designs that they've been putting up. They're trying to look like some dystopic 2050, projected 30 years in the future
Yes.
type of thing. And graffiti immediately is just spread all across the facades because people don't respect it. It's kind of like I think,
Hmm.
but when Cynthia and I went to Rome a little while ago, there's a lot more there's a certain sacredness to the beautiful buildings everywhere, and I didn't really see much in the way of graffiti. There was a little bit here and there, as there always is,
Yeah.
but nothing comparable to the type of thing you see in the ugly cities. So I think that, yeah, like you said, it's if you treat a city with dignity, it becomes a reflection of how people see themselves, and they won't want to
Hmm.
deface
The
this
beauty of the city.
exactly, because it's like defacing yourself almost. You want
Hmm.
to you develop more self honor. So I thought that that was just an interesting observation. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I know that there's also a question in the audience. Do you want to?
No, go on, go on.
Okay. Jerry, comment on a question.
Okay, can you hear me there?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to thank Professor Garcia. It's just a wonderful lecture, and you made me think that your whole discussion of modernism coming in the 20th century. It made me something I haven't thought about in a long time. Um, when I was young, I got to spend a lot of time in the United States and travel around to a lot of little towns. And I made a habit of studying the architecture of the post office because it seemed to be, the center of the town. And the post offices that were built in the late 19th century, the 1800s, were beautiful. And they'd have these big columns, and on the roof they had the triangle. And they told me this is Greco-Roman architecture. And I thought, this is wonderful. You come into town, you go to the post office, and it's really uplifting. But then I noticed a change. And towns that had their post offices built in the early 20th century, they had this thing called Art Deco. And I really found it ugly. And the whole, atmosphere of going to the post office changed. And then after a decade of that crap, the post offices that were built after that were basically just brick boxes, nothing to them, just a square box. And when you were talking about this modernism, in my mind, I keep thinking of this Art Deco and how it destroyed the beautiful arches and columns you used to see. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this Art Deco fad was, because it just ruined architecture over here in Canada and the United States. And thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you. Well, I'm far from being an Art Deco expert, and but I think, and there are even, for instance, in Belgium, in Brussels, there's an architect there. I've seen some examples, and some of his Art Deco is quite interesting. But I think I see what you mean, in the sense that in terms of music, I would say that it's almost going from a classical, the Greco-Roman tradition, going almost from the Baroque in music, from Bach, to Art Deco is more of a movement that is not modernism, but introduces it's like a romantic thing, so it's pretty much based on me, let's say, on the author, like in music, uh, and I'm talking about things that I'm not a total expert, but this is my interpretation. The 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 author becomes a major force in it. Unlike in, for instance, in the Baroque, where you had this idea of the, I've actually referred in the book Affect and Lyre, which there was a common language to be followed, the fugue, the this and that, and some of the things were already defined, like uh, F major, the key of F major was used for pastoral music, and um, and then with romanticism, there was, even if it was embedded on that highly, because some of those practitioners were highly educated people, but we had the the change into a romantic approach. So my feelings, my way of doing it, that in the beginning might be some way slight change, but then obviously with the full force of modernism, and be it in music, in architecture, and the arts, it just becomes the only thing. Let's say it's a change. Probably Art Deco is still there in the middle, and I would compare it to to the romantic in music and in painting, before the 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 author becomes everything, which is what we have now in terms of architecture. I look at cities, and for instance, I lived in London. I haven't been there for a while, but there's a common, uh, when you walk through the traditional streets, uh, there's a sense of unity. Whereas when for instance, when you go into the city or stuff like, each building is its own statement, and considering that also, for instance, in that case, it has to do with the financial power, each one has to be bigger, more impressive. So that sort of traditional um, concept of the city and of building as a whole changes completely. As changes also this thing that I try to illustrate in the presentation, that is architecture used to be subservient to man, to serve a purpose. Um, Probably it doesn't need to be in ancient Egypt or in a cathedral, but even, as you say, a post office looked like a post office. It served that purpose. And then, if you ask somebody now to design one, it will become his vision of a post office. So you go there and you have no idea what it means, what it represents, because it doesn't represent anything of what it used to do. It's just something new, because we all have to do something new, because we need to be published, we need to be striking, to be strident, to everything has to be new at this, and it generates generally. I'm sorry, I'm escaping a little bit your question about the about Art Deco. It just uh, just becomes the world that we live in now, where everything is it loses a sense of communality. Things don't work together. It's like putting different things, uh, just opposing them, and each one of them is built on an ego, not so much on on a tradition and a function. So modernism took just the function, and now we've evolved further than that, like further even to postmodernism, postmodernism, where things don't mean anything. It's just a statement for the statement's sake. So obviously, I think in my view, it generates uh, places and cities and buildings that people don't relate to. I mean, it doesn't look like a school. It doesn't look like a post office. What is it? It's just so people become very lost and very. It's nihilistic in terms of, like, what is this altogether? So sorry, I don't know if that made much sense.
Yeah, that was good. That was clear. Um, Stephen Doyle has two items. One is a simple question. I think it's a simple question. And the other one before that, Stephen, you shared two links to an executive order passed in August relating to Greco-Roman styles and architecture
Oh.
passed in Washington. Could you summarize, Stephen, a little bit of what's contained in that executive order and also then follow it up with your question?
Sure. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Professor. I loved your presentation. Quite fascinating.
Thanks.
In terms of the articles that I'm linking to, there are Trump's or the White House an executive order mandating, I believe, a preference in American civic architecture for beauty and classical architectural principles. So, without getting into any more details, and reading stuff wrote, I just thought I'd forward that for your consideration. Seeing as how, at least in the current U.S. administration, there appears to be a marked preference for a return to classical architecture in civic buildings. Perhaps after the Obama Presidential Library and other things, that's a warranted thing. My question itself more pertains to residential architecture. I'm thinking possibly of venturing and embarking upon having a house built. I know there are some magnificent examples of residential architecture that normally involve the use of an architect. That tends to imply a more affluent client that can afford an architect for a smaller scale, as opposed to an architect normally being associated with a civic scale project. Is there a resource or some form of references that individuals can peruse themselves, perhaps, to look at incorporating classical architectural principles and design principles into residential homes versus I know in Canada, it seems that most of them are what we would call builders' homes, optimized to maximize profits, minimize lot size, land use, and so on and so forth. So they tend to be kind of soulless and formulaic and express the current iteration of what you were railing against in terms of modernism. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the residential side.
As a resource, I don't know specifically what exists. When I worked in London as a trainee, I worked in let's call it a modernist um, office. I was training there, and then I stayed for a couple of years more. And once or twice, I had to go to, I don't know why, to Covent Garden to another architect's office, and they were working on traditional architecture. So, but it was odd. First, I was sort of, I liked the modernist, and I worked with the modernist idea. So I was a little bit looking at it and feeling a bit odd, and at the same time, I was fascinated because. Let's be clear, what some of these people were doing in London was not actually having any classical concepts. They were doing pastiche. So they were just building basically a box and then putting the trappings, it was not built as a column a column wasn't supporting anything. It was all decoration, which I found, it's I was fascinated looking at it because I said I couldn't work here. I wouldn't know what to do, how do you do? Because it's all like if you imagine if you the wall of your living room, you put some columns like like in a Greek temple. It's not doing anything. So it's just all a plastical thing. So I was like, well, I don't think that's the way forward. Although I understand that if you're living in an area of London where it's protected and everything, you should follow those rules. But I think it can be a little bit more honest in terms of construction being the expression of the actual materials. So that's one thing. The other one, strikes me a little bit deep because I've dwelled in modernism for the longest period in my life until 2016, 17. when I was studying for my PhD, and I started questioning a lot of things and looking at the city in a different way. I wasn't producing anything, I wasn't designing anything, I was just writing and looking at images and looking at the effects of that. That's why my thinking changed. So that has caused another problem for me, which is if you ask me to, I haven't been having any projects lately. What would I do if I was confronted with a project? That would be a problem for me because, I don't believe in that language, but I don't believe in pastiche as well, just making a fake column there. So I don't know. I don't know. I think that's really something to think about, being more honest architects about being, doing a house that looks like a house, it's built like a house, and doesn't want to be a statement in itself for the glory of its own, architect and creator for him to photograph and sell to magazines. And but as for what you're asking specifically, I don't know about that, but I can look into it and see if there are resources for that sort of picking up language bits is what you're saying, language elements of classical and using them. That's more or less what you're asking, right?
Yeah, language, concepts, and
Yeah,
maybe examples of how those were
yeah.
incorporated into residential architecture.
I'm sure there are. I can look into that. Actually, it's interesting and see if so that you can talk to an architect then maybe and propose those ideas. Yeah.
Yeah,
As for
exactly.
Trump, I think that was a very clear statement because Obama was on the opposite side. He chose this architect, David Ajay. Is black, is young, is English, and I actually know an architect here in Portugal, which is quite famous, that Ajay worked for when he was a trainee, and suddenly his career was catapulted into the stratosphere and he started and then it ended in that library, I think, which is well, I think I can say that's quite an ugly building, and it's also a statement of this sort of radical modernity of saying this is what we want. It's more than a building, it's an expression of a society that they and Trump on the opposite said like, okay, let's build the exact opposite. So I think this like the new wing, I think that is building in a sort of a classical way. Those are very clear statements, modern architecture, I think, saying like this is what we want and this is what we don't want. So I think that's interesting.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
still, that's a picture. It's a little bit older. It's still under construction, but as you can see, it
yeah.
doesn't get any more pretty than what you're seeing.
No, it doesn't, and it doesn't get more eloquent, I would say, in terms of saying like this is the radical transformation that we want, uh, and Trump saying now, no, we want to go back to um, some other stuff.
Mhm.
I think they are making statements to each other, saying like, you know,
My mother just put in a comment question regarding Orban, who it seems also has followed suit, or maybe started the suit by giving government support to a classical renewal in certain types of architecture. I don't know if there's
I
anything you
did,
can speak to that policy from Hungary.
I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me once again because it's. I think that more than architectural statements, they are uh, statements of in terms of what they want societies to become. And Hungary at this moment is probably the most conservative uh, government in Europe. Doesn't want immigration, or at least wants some control, unlike most of the other countries, Hungary and Italy probably being, and Poland, obviously. But all the other, I think those pictorial or these construction statements have a lot to do with showing and showing the people, let's say, what are the views of this endless progressivism or a return to more stable sort of looking and feeling societies. And that's, I think, a big fight here in Europe. And I think that Europe is being torn apart completely by that discussion.
Mhm. Doug has a few interesting thoughts to share. Doug, you want to pick one or two observations and toss them out there? You just got to take yourself off of mute where you are
All
by
right.
default.
You can hear me now.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking this thing really covers a lot of different topics, but in a condensed form, it's like the same theme keeps coming up again and again across, here we have architecture and art and construction and, what thoughts are lying behind it. And it's like they're all full of themselves so much that they're making ugly stuff in one way of putting it. They're like, look at me and my thing I'm imposing on you, with these straight lines and it's like completely arbitrary. And it's like it's all about them. That's the essence I get. And then that's the nihilism and the hubris coming through. And then to promote that as this is what we're about now kind of thing. It's like they're hijacking every connection we had with why you would do a building differently in the first place. It's not about some decoration. It's about some holistic thing that speaks to truth, right? So anyway, I just see it across the board. You're seeing it in politics, like the hubris with the U.S. is you know talking about how it's setting the high moral standard for behavior while it's doing exactly the opposite. I think the two are intimately related.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And uh, that it's obviously conflicting views coming into into a clash. But for instance, it might be it's not just saying, for instance, being modern or being traditional. Sometimes it gets a bit more confusing. For instance, because in the Third Reich, Albert Speer promoted this classical, apparently looking classical architecture. Uh, but I would say that probably he had this very uh, modernist ideas in a way, in terms of control, in terms of the of what he was this uh, extremely what's the word uh, an architecture that displays that immense power, but then it was sort of composed by some classical trappings. I think that at least that's my interpretation. So sometimes it's a bit confused, or many of the times it's a bit confusing. Yes, but on the overall, I can understand in some countries this statement saying like, we don't want that. We don't want this radical transformation, this continuous. Uh, change of models and it also plays a role, like I was talking to Matt, I think it was before the we started, this idea, for instance, that it's so confusing people is also very has always been very useful. So we have this idea now of 15 minutes cities, which are not really 15-minute cities. They are little 15-minute prisons, with surveillance and everything, because this is done by the same people that always propose modernist ideas. So they're bringing back an idea, which is a 15-minute city, which is a technocratic way of calling a traditional city, a city where you have everything close by, your school, the school for your children, the supermarket, the place where you work, and you can walk around. So they are putting that traditional idea into a technocratic view, which is an idea of surveillance. That's why I use in the beginning of the presentation those drawings of the panopticon. And at the same time, you cannot believe that these people are really talking about 15-minute cities that are comfortable, thinking of the comforts and safety of the people. They just want to control them because otherwise, for instance, here in Europe, you wouldn't call your main architecture program from Brussels the new Bauhaus. So you're making a statement that you want a new Bauhaus, a new modernist approach, one of the most radical schools, modern schools, and then you want a traditional city. So which one is it? I don't think it's any of them. They just want to confuse people with this meaningless architecture also creates a meaningless city, like you're going to a post office and you have no idea what building is that. Things don't have meanings, so people don't get attached to them. Graffiti comes up, defacing buildings. You don't do that with beautiful buildings, and so people are just confused and more easily sold these uh, supposed good ideas, which are not. Obviously, if you think of it a little bit, who wants to live in a 15-minute city? I mean, if it really was uh, a traditional city where you have a peaceful and enjoyable life, and you don't have to commute for 1 hour one way and 1 hour back, that's okay. But it's not. We clearly understand that that's not what the governments want, unfortunately.
There's something I noticed that's when I was doing a little bit of work on the Annenelbe of Heinrich Himmler, that there was
Hmm.
a project which may or may not be connected to what you've observed regarding Albert Speer, which was this um, network of medieval cities that Himmler envisioned, which would have sort of a very, would be a little microcosm of what he wanted the world to be as far
No,
as,
I don't.
yeah, no, it's weird. It's like there are these guild socialist kind of like structures that would each be independent, would have like a renewal of, the more noble traditions and aesthetics. And he used the right language, but the idea, it seemed like it was obviously very clearly eugenics based because you'd have like,
Yeah.
a lord, an Aryan lord overseeing, kind of like the old Templars would oversee the feudal structure, right? Or the Norman barons, the robber barons of the Normans. Uh, but there's something very similar in our modern age with King Charles, which goes back, I think, a good 15 years or so, where he's
Hmm.
begun overseeing these medieval cities, these like little, and they're very pretty. They're very
Hmm.
pretty little commune type of styles, maybe 15-minute adjacent. I'm not too sure. Um, but did you have any thoughts about King Charles's initiative? I know Roger Scruton was an overseer of some of these medieval restoration cities by the monarchy. Have you been looking at that stuff at all, or any thoughts about that?
Yes, I did. I did. And at the beginning, to be honest, I was still in my modernist journey, so I thought that was absolute nonsense because well, some of the buildings you opposed to, I actually still found them interesting. But then my perspective started to change, and I've even after time being embedded in this modernist sort of thinking and producing, I thought some of the things that he said made some sense, and I think they resonate even more now. And there was an architect that I At the time, I didn't pay much attention because he was a traditionalist. But then I got to know his work and see a lot of his lectures and interviews, and he was a very important person. He passed away, I think, a year ago, and he was called Leon Krier. And I also met him through a traditionalist architect friend here in Portugal, and they were actual friends, and um, and they were in contact, Leon Krier and now the King Charles, and uh, and I started to understand that his vision was very interesting. And but once again, he was talking about traditionalist architecture that was not just a sort of facade, like I was saying, an epidermic sort of thing, but really uh, honest in the way that he was building the materials. And he actually, I don't remember his name, he quoted a very, the architect that he probably respected more in the world, which was an Egyptian that actually built with proper materials and traditional building techniques. And these buildings that were completely, let's say, in our current way of looking into the world, they were completely invisible, because you wouldn't notice them almost because they were so traditional. And they worked because they worked in the sense of, for instance, they were building in Cairo and other places in Egypt. And this traditional architecture works in terms of problems of heating, problems of dealing with the cold or with the heat or with the sun or with the lack of sun, all of this. And we had this in many, many traditions in the world that have been completely lost, from higher examples to more, let's put it that way, primitive examples of things like that actually worked. Whereas now we build a box and then it's too hot or it's too cold, and it lost the meaning from an outside point of view, let's say it, but it lost its intrinsic meaning as well as something that was made to make sense and to solve problems. Now it doesn't solve anything, and and uh, and you have these cities like like in Dubai. If they run out of energy for a couple of weeks, the city will disappear, will be taken by the desert. So all these things that we listen to now about sustainability, I think they mean exactly the opposite. Uh, when some people obviously are honest about that, and there are problems to solved, but I would say that most of the time, all these regulations, for instance, in the EU of being sustainable, they are all except sustainable. Maybe creating environments like the 15-minute cities that are detrimental to people above all, not caring about people and not caring about the environment. I don't believe in any of that.
Hmm. Well, yeah, and that does seem to be the ultimate, or one of the ultimate ironies, and a lot of this is that this modernist revolution was sort of sold to people from the standpoint of a utilitarianism that
Hmm.
superseded or overrode considerations of frivolous aesthetics and things that they said, oh, that's we shouldn't allow that in. We need usefulness. But then you actually look at where the evolution of this has naturally brought us,
Yes,
and it's completely useless.
yes, yes.
It's pretty funny in some weird way. But there's definitely a lot to think about, and you've given us so much to chew on. And I really hope that this inspires many people watching to go out and buy your book, leave a review, spread the word, because it's a really high value philosophical considerations. And I'm noticing that before I round it out, that Matthew Thomas just raised his digital hand and got in just in time. Hey, Matthew, go for it.
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation today. This was wonderful. Um, really enjoyed it. Lots, like Matt, like you said, lots to think about um, and chew on. Uh, you mentioned, Rui, that you were on this journey of kind of a traditional modernist designer, and then something kind of happened, or you went through a process of change. You mentioned that now a couple of times, where could you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, was it kind of a Saul on the road to Damascus kind of moment where you realized, oh wait, something has gone horrifically wrong here, or was it more kind of, was there a particular catalyst for the change in your direction of your personal journey?
Thanks. I think it might be difficult to pinpoint for me, but I've always had doubts about many things, but especially about people like Corbusier. I've visited some of his buildings, and I always thought that there was something like I talked in the presentation in the book, a cult-like thing about him that it didn't make much sense. I mean, his urban plans were horrific, all of them, and completely fascist, by the way. And I always thought about that, but during the 2016, 17, I started my PhD and I wanted to address a number of things. Um, it didn't turn out exactly. The research goes in ways that are difficult to control, but then I basically, in very general terms, I was talking about the importance of drawing, of sketching, of the analogical, that and the way it surpasses the digital, this thing that we have now all around us. You press a key and you have a building apparently done. But anyway, that tradition that comes from centuries ago of thinking through drawing, or drawing as thinking, uh, that Vasari talks, and it's present obviously in Michelangelo and Da Vinci. So I was interested in this organic way of building. I was not so much centered on any ideas about modernism or or, or classicism or anything. That came, but that came up at the same time because I started realizing, I don't know what exactly triggered it. Maybe it was just a whole process, that a lot of the that well, we were watching these things that were like emperor's new clothes. That if you took a step back, and that could be in art as well. If you took a step back and looked at them, they made no sense at all. And it's a process. The more I started thinking like that and observing things like that, and sort of shedding some of the ways that I used to look and think, because I was uh, deep in the research, looking at drawings, looking at this and how this affects that, and how this way of approaching drafting, drawing, or being more computer related, what's the produced outcome in terms of a project, and also thinking about that in the arts. And then once I started to take those steps back, I think there was no turning back. That's going against myself in a way, because I look at the things that I did, and it's not, it's not very meaningful for me now. Like I was saying, if somebody presents me with a project to do, I'll be a little bit lost, because I don't want to do pastiche, but I don't want to make statements like I've done or try to do in the past. I think that generates, and I see that more and more around here, it generates cities and places that are becoming more and more devoid of meaning. So that was something that happened during my PhD, and I think about it. What started it? Well, also at the time I read a work by a scholar, this woman in Australia, that that made me think, and then I contacted her through Facebook, she's called Simone Brott, and she wrote a paper, or maybe then a book, I think, which was then published in France, if I, or was at the same time that a book was published in France about Le Corbusier, and the title of her paper is something like "Was Le Corbusier a Fascist?" And there was a book, one or two books in France by French authors about it, and it was a big thing socially because it was like touching this untouchable person, you know. It was an offense, but in fact, it was. Everybody knows that. In the same way that an architect like Terragni was the personal, let's say, personal architect of Mussolini. And these people, I was taught, I studied their work, and I was always taught that were they were highly, well, commendable. You know, their work was embedded with modernism, and modernism had to do with this evolution of society. And when I came to think about it, it means nothing of that in terms of thinking, in theoretical terms, and also in empirical terms, in what I observe around me here, in other places. It's all it's absurd because it doesn't happen. But sorry to reply to your question. I wish I could reply better because it fascinates me what changed, and not only that, because then you evolve in a certain direction. And sometimes, for instance, what I'm talking about right now here with all of you, I have an audience that is engaged in some of the things that I say. If I was talking to architects now, they would think that I was, I don't know, lost, talking about some questioning things that you cannot question because it's always a process, isn't it? When you start to question this, question that, and then question a little bit further, and then if you get into this questioning a little bit too further on up there, you just don't understand it, and people are. And I think that they feel the effects of, for instance, these cities and this sort of absolutely visual architecture, which is all a lie as well in a way, and the effects that it has on their own the way that they feel about themselves in their daily lives. For instance, going to a museum or to a place that it's more a gesture by its creator than to a place where things are put in a in a way that makes sense. I was talking to a friend the other day, and she was in Cairo, and she was saying, like, you know, the new museum is horrible. You know, it's this immense thing that it's in there, and she just wanted to go to the old one because the old one is in the middle of the city, and it's maybe it doesn't have the best conditions, but whatever, it doesn't matter. It has a soul to it. It has a character. The things are displayed not with those, you know, fashionable, how do you call them, projects of exhibition projects, you know, no, not all the notes make sense, and not everything is wrong, but it has the building has a life, has a meaning, and the things work there, you know, the old artifacts and everything, and it's within the city. You come out of there and you walk through and you see people, not in the middle of a new place where it's all where you have to take a bus, or although you have to take that in Cairo to see some monuments, but I think you understand what I mean, where everything it's this building that it's in the Giza Plateau, but it could be in Norway, something like that. You know, it doesn't make any sense.
Thank you again so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks.
All right, we got a couple of more questions. Are you okay with two more questions, Rui?
Sure.
Okay. Magdalena.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. And I'm so happy because you confirmed But I always thought about Corbusier, that I consider this to be a complete cult around him. So thank you. Secondly, I thought, when you go into a building, you have a certain emotional impression or emotional response to the building. Like if you enter a cathedral, you're awestruck, and you almost reduce yourself to whispering in there, and it's beautiful and uplifting. Okay, and that's all. I always thought that was the purpose of architecture, to evoke a certain response in you. Okay, an emotion in you, and then now I'm going to veer off your topic a little bit. Okay, because we did talk about AI a little bit, and so I was thinking about the impact of AI on language. And I was thinking about the components of writing. When you write and you use imagery and you use metaphors and you use similes, and what happens to these components of speech when you use AI to supposedly write something? Do you have any opinion on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I do. And in the book, obviously, the presentation, I didn't, there was no time to speak further. I talked a little bit about Korzybski and David Bohm. And Bohm is really interesting when he talks about that idea that when we talk about things, we use words, but the meanings are not. They are bigger than those words, and words can only take you so far. So we have sort of a double problem. So words don't represent all that we want to say, like Korzybski, I think, said. I don't remember the quotation. What we want normally, what we want to talk about is not words. We use them just to talk about everything else. So there is this problem, and I think this is when the metaphor comes, when we use the metaphor and we use analogy, and that's why I try to talk about buildings that are so eloquent, and I could have used cathedrals or churches that are so eloquent in what they transmit that they transform their metaphors into themselves. They are not their representation of something becomes something, and when you are inside a church, inside a building, you feel that it completely overwhelms you sometimes with emotion, and also because it's referent to a language that we understand, because I think most of the time they are related, like that idea of the mecanthropos, of finding the macrocosm in the microcosm, and the relations with the proportions of the human body and all of that. And I think we lost all of that. But in terms of words, AI as something that I think is another expression of losing meaning, because it's like this. You type into chat GPT or something like that, and those words are turned into numerical values that then go through this sort of it's an extraordinary process anyway, because as me and Matt were talking, I think also before the recording, it's sometimes you put a little text and ask to improve it a little bit, and it does it. But it's only not a game with words. It's a game with mathematical values that represent such words. So it's all a deception. What comes out in the end, it might look good, but it's nothing because the machine doesn't think. It has no soul. It's nothing, and it picks up uh, numerical values that are attributed to certain words, and through stochastic processes, it chooses them, let's say, and it produces a result at the end, which, for the way it does it, it is quite extraordinary to believe that, to see that that is happening, and that you can write a little blurb, but that it's poorly written and it comes out in a nice way. But it's like a magician's trick. What's happening in there, and it might look very good and impressive. It's not reality, but we have taken that simulation, that sort of magic, into being something, and that scares me because that's not even words that are being turned into something that makes sense. It's not even that. But then you have that other level, which I think you were talking about, which like David Bohm talks about. What those are not even words, but we when we use words, we don't really use them in themselves. We want to talk about something that is not words. So we're always using analogy, and we're always using these very elevated forms of thinking. So we using words to convey other things. And if you read, like I tried to show in the presentation, you read a great poem, and then you might be inspired to write music or do something. We are always listening to music as inspiration, and there are pieces of music that makes us relax, and it seems as if they elate us to other levels where we can think more clearly, etc. So we have all of that, and instead we not only lose the metaphor, the capacity for using words to represent something more than they are, like the notes on a musical notation represent more than those symbols. They represent music, and we don't even have that, but we have even less, because what these AI tools use is not even the word. So it's a world of pure, simple, and total deception. And what scares me is that people believe in this. People, I read things which make me, I don't know, it's bizarre, saying about should we protect the rights of AI? What rights? That's a machine. That's not a person. It's not an animal. And but we are getting embedded into this thinking, which is completely absurd. The other day, I said to a friend, I think she was very offended. Like abortion is encouraged, but then we have to discuss AI rights. Well, there must be something really profoundly dark in this society when a human life might not be that valued. And I'm not talking about other discussions around this topic, but it's just we I love animals, and for instance, and animals have an interpretation, and they have I think they have a soul, and they have for sure they have an understanding of us, a connection to us. But how can you transfer it? I think there must be something deeply wrong in a society that thinks that might transfer that to machines. Like I showed in the presentation. The book is a little bit more developed. Like we don't really know what intelligence is because animals are intelligent. An octopus is very intelligent. Dogs, cats, dolphins, and we don't really understand what it is. We don't really understand what's consciousness. And yet, by a set of technocratic rules, now you can read a paper that says that if a machine does this and this and this, it's self-aware. Well, this again is like a magician's trick. It's not true, and I find that these things are deeply worrying because people are just so bombarded on a daily basis with all these ideas that they like I was saying before, they don't take a step back and look at it and take it for what it is, which is pure nonsense.
Yeah.
And I hope that replied the question.
I was thinking a little bit. I was reading an article regarding a lot of these tech billionaire types who have children and don't permit their children generally to utilize the devices that they themselves promote, whether, Instagram or X or anything. And there are a number of these tech Silicon Valley billionaire types who are talking about how they don't allow their kids to use anything which features less than 15 minutes of command of thinking at one time. So no short videos, no little blips like TikTok and things, because it does scramble the mind's ability to just philosophize, to ponder deeply into anything. So you get the semblance through endorphin rewards and other things that you're getting the semblance of maybe feeling informed, but there's none of the reality of it. And to the degree that we allow the fragmentation of our concentration span of our thoughts, people become less equipped to be able to do exactly what you've been saying, which is to recognize what are the limits of artificial intelligence. And they fall prey to arguments that say, well, this is obviously a superior form of intelligence than anything humans ever done. And then you get all of these absurd debates about what are the rights of AI. Should we have, I guess, digital bathrooms for what AI chooses to identify as, or what about your digital girlfriend? Can't find a girl or a boyfriend in the real world? Well, now you can craft your own that'll listen to you and give you all of your needs, and you don't have
annoy you.
Yeah, you don't have to listen to them fart or anything. So, but people take this stuff seriously. It's really, really, it's crazy. But the fragmentation, I think, is a big part of it. And like you were saying, and Doug even said this in the chat. Doug wrote, "Meaning can only be situated by reference to the eternal." And this is precisely what modernism disconnects us from. And I like that a lot, that the binary system of a computer is intrinsically finite. We have a finite aspect of it with our material senses. But poetry, the greatest quality of arts, always has a quality, like you said, of the maximum reflected in the minimum, right? That there's a healthy form of as above, so below. That's not absurd. Which you find in the greatest of architecture and poetry. I don't know if that's anything you'd like to comment on.
Yes, no, it's just that, like listening to a great piece of music and having the will to, for instance, when I was in some more difficult moments trying to write the book, and I would go back, and I think we all do this, to some music that transports us to somewhere peaceful or somewhere where we find inspiration, and because that does it, changes our perception, and you read a poem and then you think of music, you listen to music, and you think of mathematics. For like Bohm, for instance, he spoke, David Bohm, he was this book that he has, Science, Creativity and Art and Creativity, I don't remember the name, where he reflects about all these aspects. And he was a guy deeply, I mean, what can be more mathematical than the world of quantum physics, of things that you don't really see? So is deep inside that, but he says that there's more to understanding than mathematics, and but that has been uh, engineered into us, and I think that architecture played a role. The music is playing a role. I think music is really important because it's something that we can close our eyes to, or it's everywhere. We might not look at art and find it ugly, but music, we find ourselves listening to it, and it's currently, I'm going to say it. I think it's really bad, and it's repetitive, and it doesn't make you think a lot, change contexts, think of other things. It's not imbued with complexity. That's one of the problems. And also, on another level, you were talking about these tech giants, and they have, most of them, a very, very dark view of the world. Very dark. Uh, and I wasn't aware of it. I was watching an interview the other day by Tucker Carlson with this guy that talks about Nick Land and all these people from the Dark Enlightenment, and all these people have a very low image of humanity. They are mostly, well, they are very connected to the occult and to eugenics, and they want a feudal system.
Yep.
Where a new sort of feudal system, and if and one of the nihilistic things that I find most incredible is like they are not, because I mean we talk about the environment, and then we have data centers that consume massive amounts of power, water, and destroy the life of people around them. So that's not true. Why use them so that we can all have our own ChatGPT? But then it's like, obviously this is destructive. And at the same time, some of them really say, well, who cares? Let's see what happens. It's a massive experiment. And these people, let's put it this way, we're not in very good hands with those people in any way.
Yeah. That's an
That's my,
understatement. That's an
that's,
understatement.
yeah.
uh,
I won't say anything else.
yeah, yeah.
But that's it, yeah.
Yeah. All right, last question to Richard. Richard Olafson.
Great lecture. It was fabulous. I really needed that. It was just wonderful. I guess in place of metaphor, we now have mathematics. So yeah, I got so much I want to say about this, but I'm just going to narrow it down that the end game, of course. Thanks for mentioning Nick Land, who's a real serious misanthropist and hater of life as well. I agree with that. And the end game, of course, is turning mankind into machines. And somehow these guys think that the head is just filled with sprockets and gears, and it somehow generates thoughts or some kind of mechanistic view of things. And but there's also the beginning of modernism is of course the response to the machine. There was an unspoken message that went out to the artist to now write sonnets in praise of the turbine, but I feel I've been fighting against modernism and postmodernism all my life. I'm working as a poet, and it's very difficult right now because it's dominated by a lack of meaning. There was a time when poets believed in truth. Truth was central to the poetry. Modernism was a step away from that. In the architecture, it separated the body from spirit, but 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 it did concentrate on individual meaning, and that was central to its role. Every artist had their own individual meaning to deconstruct, and then in 1947, the art the artists, especially the poets, stopped believing in truth entirely, and that was the beginning of postmodernism. Postmodernism, of course, was invented by the CIA. Ezra Pound, one of the progenitors of postmodernism, he was a modernist, but he was a big influence on the movement towards postmodernism. Was the mentor of James Angleton, if anybody.
No way, really?
Yes, yes. In fact, I'll tell you a little story about James Angleton. His family was very wealthy, and they used to go skiing in the Alps in northern Italy, and they his family struck up a friendship with Ezra Pound, and Ezra Pound mentored the young James Angleton in poetry, and so he entered the Yale. He entered Yale, the Yale English department, and studied poetry. And while he was at Yale, he started a poetry magazine, and he published Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound asked his friend T.S. Eliot for a couple poems as well. And so he was publishing a lot of the postmodernists, and then. But the Yale alumni were always they got moved. A lot of them got moved into the CIA. But Whittaker Chambers was also went to the Yale English department. Anyways, I just wanted to mention. I thought I'd mention the. Are you familiar, Matt, and anybody here familiar with the biodigital convergence, which was on the Government of Canada website?
I did hear about that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I read it and. Wrote a little bit about it as well, because it says that in the future, this was appeared January 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, and in the biodigital convergence document it says, I think they buried it now. They buried it at the back end of the Government of Canada website, so it's more difficult to find. But they said that we are in the future. We are moving away from. We may not be considered human in the future, and that Canada is moving away from vitalism.
Yeah, it's scary, and if you've
written, very scary.
You've written about that.
I wrote this in it's called Shifting Towards Vitalism. And it was written in December 2020 and January.
Well, Richard, what we'll do? Let's do this. Let's have a conversation, and maybe you could present on some of the topics you raise in your book, in your writings as well, in an upcoming RTF lecture.
Oh yeah, okay, sure. I wasn't expecting that, but
I think that'd be a good idea. Maybe send me a link to your book to look more into it. And I think that's why it's really great to have these types of conversations and presentations, because we need a remedy to this dystopic way of thinking, which is causing people to think to get into a headspace where they believe that it is just this inevitable thing that human beings are the obsolete software to be overridden by the superior software of human 2.0.
We're going to bring in the new models, which they're going to create themselves. And
yeah, right. And if people don't have these in some ways they're elementary philosophical ideas that Rui has presented, but in many ways they're better. I mean, they're so much better than gold, because gold, you can only carry it. It doesn't rust. But at the end of the day, it can't save your life. It can't save humanity, whereas ideas do. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, ideas are very important. Yeah, they're valuable. I'd love to do that, Matt. You want to hear about Paul Demand, by the way? Do you know about Paul Demand?
Well, we're sort of wrapping up today's presentation, though. So
I gotta tell you about. I gotta tell
let's
you
leave
this
that as a
story.
cliffhanger. Okay, we'll leave that as a cliffhanger
Well,
for.
it's all about deconstruction, how deconstruction happened, and it came from the Nazis.
Well, I think that would be a very good presentation to use as a starting point to expand upon.
I wanted to tell you because of I've been reading a lot of Cynthia's work on the Nazis and so on, and I don't know if she's ever encountered this story. So
No, I don't
anyway,
think
I'll
so.
tell you.
Reach
I'll tell
out,
you.
reach out to me, and then all right, we got a
Tell you
cliffhanger.
later.
We got a cliffhanger. All right.
Okay. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Of course. Thank you, Richard.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for the lecture. What's that? Okay. Thanks for the lecture.
All right, Reed, did you want to make any comments on some of Richard's observations?
I was looking through my own book actually, and couldn't find it. And somebody, because I was trying to remember one of the things he was referring, and somebody thankfully put it there. I don't know where it is in my book, which is the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Yes.
It's word for word, verbatim, from the Jerusalem Post by Benjamin Netanyahu in 1990. If we get caught, they will just replace us with a person from the same cloth.
Okay, sorry, that was a little, somebody fell off of mute there. Okay, go for it. Yeah, the Congress of Cultural.
Yes. So all of this, I don't get into that because the presentation in 1 hour, but in the book I talk about that. Pollock is a great example of somebody that was financed by the CIA. And and that's in painting, that shift where, once again, like I was trying to question in the presentation, was it in the zeitgeist? Not really. And one of the things that, just to finish, that I think it's really interesting and sort of as a way of making all of this, what's the word? Trying to make it into a simple statement. When modernism had this thing of representing a shift into an enlightened society, expressing the values of such society, such societal change, the zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it. But apparently no. What you got actually, when you look at the production of artists, is not the move into a sort of a new society with this mechanistic paradigm or whatever it was. It's just completely individual self-expressions. So that might get people to think about it. What's the meaning of it? Even not going into the fact that it was highly subsidized by the CIA and in the writers, everything. So yes, it was all highly contrived, and I think, at least that's why I try to argument in the book, this that we have now is not that much different. It comes in tandem with many things that have happened in the past. So I think, well, that's it.
Thank you, Rui. I'm so grateful. And like I said, your book is going to be made available in the description box for people who want to buy it, share it, write a review. Go to the description box under this video once it's up on YouTube in a few days and do that. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your time and questions today. All right, till next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.